The 1980s gave us blockbusters, neon fashion, and Saturday morning cartoons, but lurking beneath that bright surface was a darker side of cinema. Exploitation films that pushed so hard they got banned, protested, or yanked right out of theaters. Some were accused of corrupting kids, others of going too far with gore, but all of them left a trail of controversy that still lingers. Which American shockers did censors try hardest to erase? Let's find out. Evilspeak, 1981. Clint Howard isn't the name most people think of when they picture terrifying horror icons, but in Evilspeak, he carved out a place in exploitation history. This bizarre film mixes military school bullying, satanic rituals, and early 80s computer paranoia into a stew so strange that it quickly earned itself a ban in multiple countries. And in America, it was the kind of movie parents groups hated, the kind they swore was corrupting youth. Howard plays Stanley Coopersmith, a cadet tormented by classmates and ignored by teachers. One day he stumbles across an ancient book of black magic. Instead of tossing it, he feeds it into a clunky Apple II-style computer. Suddenly, the machine starts spitting out spells. Stanley uses his newfound demonic power to get revenge in ways that still make audiences squirm. Graphic deaths involving dogs, decapitations, and one of the nastiest finales of the era. When it hit the UK, Evilspeak was slapped straight onto the video nasties list. In the US, it barely survived the MPAA, but still got trimmed in some cities. Religious groups already on high alert thanks to The Exorcist's lingering shadow. Targeted theaters showing it, labeling it dangerous. VHS releases circulated uncut, but many stores quietly refused to stock it. Looking back, what makes Evilspeak stand out isn't just the gore, it's how it captured early anxieties about technology. In 1981, computers were mysterious, powerful, and terrifying to most people. The idea of a kid summoning evil through a floppy disk hit a nerve. Today it's a cult favorite, but in the 80s, Evilspeak was a flashing warning sign about where horror could go. Faces of Death and 1981. Few movies scared authorities as much as the Faces of Death series. The first film already had a reputation as the one you weren't supposed to watch, but Faces of Death 2 took that legend and ran with it. Released in 1981, it doubled down on the disturbing formula. Staged gore presented alongside real accident footage. For many, it was impossible to tell which was fake, and that's what made it so controversial. Director John Allen Schwartz framed it as an educational documentary exploring mankind's fascination with death. But the real draw was shock value. Grisly car crashes, executions, war footage, and stage scenes made to look horrifyingly real. Teens rented it at video shops thinking it was forbidden fruit, and word of mouth spread like wildfire. Parents panicked, politicians demanded bans, and in several American cities, screenings were canceled under pressure. While the U.S. never issued a nationwide ban, Faces of Death 2 was seized in some local raids and refused placement at major chains. In the UK and Australia, it was banned outright, joining the original on the list of illegal titles. The controversy only helped its sales. Underground VHS copies circulated in schoolyards, turning it into the ultimate dare-you-to-watch-it movie of the 80s. What really terrified people was the blurring of fiction and reality. Unlike slashers or creature features, Faces of Death 2 insisted it was showing the truth. Even decades later, horror fans debate which sequences were authentic and which were staged. That uncertainty made the film toxic for censors, but irresistible for audiences. In the end, Faces of Death 2 didn't just shock theaters. It became a cultural test of endurance. Were you brave enough to sit through it, or would you look away? Nightmare 1981. Nightmare, also known as Nightmare in a Damaged Brain, is one of the most infamous slashers of the early 80s. Though technically an Italian-American co-production, it was filmed largely in Florida and New York and marketed heavily in the US as an American horror story. What set it apart from countless other slashers of the time wasn't just the gore, it was the legal chaos it caused. The story follows George, a man recently released from a mental hospital who drifts into violent hallucinations and uncontrollable urges. His breakdown leads to a series of brutal killings that escalate with shocking intensity. The movie's reputation skyrocketed because the gore effects were rumored to be designed by Tom Savini, the special effects legend behind Dawn of the Dead. Though Savini denied being directly involved, his name attached to the film gave it an aura of authenticity and made critics focus even harder on the carnage. In the UK, Nightmare was banned outright under the Obscene Publications Act, and its distributor was actually jailed for releasing it. That alone gave the film instant outlaw status. In America, it was released in grindhouses but quickly ran into problems with the MPAA. The film was heavily cut, losing entire sequences before it could play publicly. Even then, some theaters refused to show it. On VHS, the uncut version became a holy grail for collectors, passed around with warnings scrawled on the label. What made Nightmare so controversial wasn't just gore, it was the raw, grimy tone. Unlike slicker slashers, it felt mean, dirty, and relentless. There was no polish, no fun scares, just brutality. For many, it crossed the line from horror into pure exploitation. And for that reason, Nightmare became a defining title of the video nasties era and a lightning rod for American censorship battles. Silent Night, Deadly Night, 1984. Few exploitation films sparked as much fury in America as Silent Night, Deadly Night. Released in 1984, this low-budget holiday slasher looked like just another seasonal gimmick at first. But the moment parents realized it featured a killer dressed as Santa Claus, the outrage exploded. Protests, boycotts, and news headlines turned it into one of the most controversial American films of the decade. The story follows Billy, a boy traumatized by witnessing his parents murdered by a man in a Santa suit. Years later, Billy grows up working in a toy store during Christmas. And when the stress piles up, he snaps, dressing as Santa and going on a murderous rampage. The imagery was shocking. Santa with an axe, Santa with a hammer, Santa punishing the naughty. The backlash was immediate. Religious groups, parents' organizations, and even major movie critics like Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert called it tasteless. TV spots featuring a killer, Santa-enraged parents who said their children were terrified by the ads alone. Under intense pressure, TriStar Pictures pulled the movie from theaters after just 1 week. VHS copies later gave it a cult following, but at the time, Silent Night, Deadly Night was treated as public enemy number 1. Ironically, the controversy helped its legend. The sequel, with its infamous Garbage Day scene, only added fuel to the fire. Today, the film is remembered as both a cult Christmas horror and a case study in how outrage can make a movie unforgettable. Silent Night. Deadly Night wasn't just banned from theaters, it was banned from the holiday spirit itself. Don't Go in the House. 1980, Don't Go in the House is one of those films where even the title feels like a warning. Released in 1980, this American exploitation horror was so grim that theaters across the country either refused to book it or pulled it after just a few screenings. The reason? Its disturbing centerpiece. A killer who incinerates his victims in a specially built steel room. The film follows Donnie, a socially awkward loner scarred by years of abuse from his mother. When she dies, his sanity unravels. Donnie begins luring women into his home, where he locks them in a fireproof chamber and burns them alive with a flamethrower. The scenes were so shocking, graphic, drawn out, and unflinching that many audiences walked out. Critics called it depraved. Theater owners called it unbookable. The MPAA slapped it with an X rating initially, forcing the producers to cut heavily just to get it released. Even then, several states banned it outright, claiming the imagery was obscene. VHS eventually gave the film a second life, but rental stores often hid it behind the counter, selling it only to curious horror fans who had heard whispers about the Burning Room movie. What makes Don't Go in the House memorable is its sheer bleakness. Unlike other slashers that reveled in camp or supernatural elements, this one felt disturbingly real. The killer wasn't a masked monster. He was a broken man with a blowtorch, and that made it all the more terrifying. For American censors, in the 80s, this was exactly the kind of movie they wanted gone. Maniac, 1980. When Maniac hit American theaters in 1980, it didn't just scare audiences, it made them furious. Directed by William Lustig and starring Joe Spinell, this grimy New York slasher was one of the decade's most controversial exploitation films. Critics called it vile, protesters gathered outside theaters, and TV stations refused to run ads for it. In some cities, it was outright banned from cinemas altogether. The film follows Frank Zito, a disturbed loner who roams New York at night, targeting women. He scalps his victims and pins their hair onto mannequins in his apartment, creating a grotesque family. Spinell's performance is raw and unsettling, making the horror feel disturbingly real. Combine that with Tom Savini's legendary gore effects, particularly the infamous shotgun head explosion, and Maniac pushed audiences further than most were willing to go. In America, the backlash was immediate. Critics like Gene Siskel called it sick and disgusting. Feminist groups picketed screenings, accusing the movie of glorifying violence against women. Some theater owners refused to book it, while others pulled it after protests. In New York City, the film's poster, showing a man clutching a bloody knife, was banned from public display. Yet all that outrage only fueled its underground success. VHS copies spread quickly, especially in urban rental shops that catered to grindhouse fans. Abroad, the film was banned in several countries, including being swept into the UK's infamous video nasties panic. Looking back, Maniac isn't just shocking. It's a grim time capsule of New York's seedy underbelly in the early 80s, Lustig shot on real city streets, capturing the grit, danger, and despair of an era when the Big Apple was at its grimiest. That authenticity made it unforgettable. Love it or hate it, Maniac earned its reputation as one of America's most notorious banned horror films. Mother's Day, 1980. Trauma Entertainment was never afraid of controversy, but with Mother's Day, they stumbled into one of their most notorious scandals. Released in 1980, this low-budget exploitation film blended backwoods horror with dark satire, and it was so nasty that several U.S. theaters refused to screen it, while some states outright banned it. The premise is simple but brutal. 3 women go on a camping trip and are captured by 2 deranged brothers under the control of their sadistic mother. What follows is a mix of humiliation, torment, and revenge, with moments that shocked even seasoned horror fans. While other slashers of the time leaned into camp or supernatural killers, Mother's Day felt meaner, nastier, and harder to laugh off. Critics destroyed it. The New York Times called it tasteless trash, while local papers urged theaters not to show it. In New Jersey and Pennsylvania, screenings were canceled after protests. The MPAA nearly refused its classification, forcing edits just to get a release. Even then, many theaters kept it off their schedules, citing community standards. Despite all this, Mother's Day slowly built a cult following. On VHS, it became a rental shop favorite, particularly among fans who wanted something worse than Friday the 13th. The controversy gave it exactly the aura it needed. Decades later, the film was reappraised as a dark satire of family dysfunction and consumer culture. But in 1980, nobody was calling it clever. They were calling it filth. For Trauma, the backlash cemented their reputation as the kings of sleazy exploitation. Mother's Day wasn't their biggest hit, but it was one of their most banned, and that made it unforgettable. Silent Scream, 1980. Silent Scream is one of those movies that doesn't get talked about as much today, but in the early 80s, it stirred plenty of controversy. Directed by Denny Harris, it was a creepy mix of slasher and haunted house thriller. And while it wasn't as gory as some of its peers, it still ended up being pulled or censored in several areas across the U.S. The film follows a group of college students who move into a large old boarding house. What they don't know is that the home hides a violent history, and its reclusive owners are guarding a deadly secret. Soon, the students are stalked one by one in a series of grisly attacks. Silent Scream got into trouble not because of relentless gore, but because of its unsettling tone and surprisingly harsh death scenes. Some theaters pulled it after local outcry, while regional distributors cut down violent sequences to appease nervous audiences. Compared to films like Maniac or Mother's Day, Silent Scream feels tame now, but back then, the mix of claustrophobic dread and shocking moments made it a target. On home video, the film had better luck. Rental stores stocked it heavily, and word of mouth kept it alive as a cult classic. Today it's remembered more as a curiosity than a masterpiece, but its censorship battles prove just how sensitive American audiences were to horror in the early 80s. Silent Scream may not have the gore reputation of its nastier peers, but it still joins the list of banned exploitation films, because it showed how even mid-tier horror could spark outrage when the climate was ripe for moral panic. Blood-Sucking Freaks, 1980. Blood-Sucking Freaks wasn't new in the 80s. It was originally released in 1976. But its re-release on VHS during the decade turned it into one of the most notorious banned exploitation films in America. Distributed by Trauma during the home video boom, this off-Broadway horror oddity about a sadistic magician running a torture theater quickly became one of the most seized titles of the era. The film's setup is outrageous. Audiences watch a stage show where women appear to be tortured for entertainment. The twist? It isn't a trick, it's real. From decapitations to cannibalism, the movie leans hard into shock value, offering one grotesque set piece after another. When the VHS landed in rental stores with its lurid artwork, censors and parents groups lost their minds. In the US, police raided video shops, seizing tapes under obscenity laws. Women's groups targeted it directly, arguing that it was dangerous. Some theaters refused to show it, while others booked it for midnight runs where controversy only drew bigger crowds. Abroad, it was banned outright in multiple countries, lumped in with the worst of the video nasties. What makes Blood-Sucking Freaks unforgettable isn't just its content, but the way it became a symbol of underground VHS culture. Horror fans whispered about it, traded bootleg copies, and dared each other to watch. Even director Joel Reed admitted later he never expected it to gain such a cult following. By the 2000s, Trauma leaned into its infamy, re-releasing it proudly with commentary from modern horror directors. But in the 1980s, it was considered one of the most dangerous movies you could rent. The bans only ensured that Blood-Sucking Freaks became a legend. Basket Case, 1982. If you ever wondered how far a shoestring budget could go in exploitation cinema, look no further than Basket Case. Released in 1982, Frank Henenlotter's debut horror film told the bizarre story of Dwayne Bradley and his deformed twin brother Belial carried around in a wicker basket and unleashed on anyone who crosses them. Cheap, grimy, and unapologetically weird, it became one of the decade's most controversial cult films. The setup was already shocking. A man and his malformed twin on a bloody revenge spree. But what really rattled people was the execution. Belial wasn't just a monster. He was a grotesque puppet, shrieking and clawing his way through scenes in ways that felt both absurd and terrifying. For censors, the combination of gore, sleaze, and sheer weirdness was enough to raise alarms. In the US, some theaters refused to screen it. Others played it at midnight, where it quickly developed a cult audience. Critics called it tasteless trash, while horror fans hailed it as genius outsider art. On VHS, it became even more infamous, with rental shops stocking it under the counter as if it were contraband. Abroad, it was banned in parts of Europe, lumped in with nastier fare, despite being far less violent than many of its peers. Basket Case is remembered today as one of the quintessential New York exploitation films, capturing the city's sleaze and danger in the early 80s. It may not have been the goriest film of the decade, but its mix of body horror and urban grit made it unforgettable. At the time, though, it was treated as something toxic, a movie parents and politicians didn't want anywhere near teenagers. Motel Hell, 1980. If the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had a twisted cousin with a wicked sense of humor, it would be Motel Hell. Released in 1980 by United Artists, this American exploitation horror shocked audiences not just with gore, but with its gleefully bizarre premise: a farmer and his sister turning unlucky travelers into smoked meat. It was marketed as a slasher, but what theaters actually got was a surreal mix of horror and pitch-black comedy that rattled both censors and critics. The story follows farmer Vincent, who runs a roadside motel with his sister Ida. But Vincent's famous smoked meats have a secret ingredient: human flesh. He and Ida trap victims, bury them in their garden up to their necks, and harvest them later for sausage. The imagery is outrageous, especially the scene where victims are muzzled like livestock, their heads bobbing in the soil. For 1980, it was a step too far. In the US, the MPAA forced edits to avoid an X rating, and in some towns, theaters outright refused to show it. Abroad, it faced bans and restrictions, lumped in with cannibal films like Cannibal Holocaust, despite being American-made. The advertising didn't help. Posters featured pig-headed killers wielding chainsaws, which caused protests from parents' groups who accused the film of glamorizing brutality. Critics shredded it, dismissing it as tasteless garbage. But audiences, especially at midnight screenings, loved it. Its blend of satire and exploitation struck a nerve, making it a cult hit on VHS after its theatrical run. The controversy only made it more popular, as fans passed it around as the Pighead Chainsaw Movie. Today, Motel Hell is recognized as one of the strangest American exploitation films of the 80s. At the time, though, it was treated as offensive, shocking, and worthy of bans. Farmer Vincent's famous line said it best: "It takes all kinds of critters to make Farmer Vincent's fritters." Theaters weren't laughing. Combat Shock, 1984. Some exploitation films hide behind camp, but Combat Shock strips away all pretense. Released in 1984 by Trauma, it's one of the bleakest American exploitation movies of the decade. Instead of delivering cheap thrills, it plunges straight into the gutter, following a traumatized Vietnam veteran trying and failing to survive in the decayed streets of Staten Island. The story centers on Frankie, a vet suffering from flashbacks and PTSD. He drifts through unemployment lines, filthy apartments, and crumbling neighborhoods while struggling to feed his malnourished wife and deformed infant son. Unlike other exploitation films that leaned into gore or over-the-top villains, Combat Shock focused on despair. The violence was grounded in social decay, and that made it more disturbing. Theatrical screenings in the US sparked outrage. Audiences expecting a grindhouse action flick walked into something far darker, a nightmare of poverty, addiction, and hopelessness. Some theaters banned it after walkouts, while others refused to book it at all, arguing it was too bleak and offensive. Abroad, it faced censorship for its unrelenting tone and harsh imagery. On VHS, Combat Shock found its cult audience, horror fans, who rented it expecting another Rambo knockoff instead, got one of the most disturbing exploitation films of the decade. Its ending, relentless and unforgettable, cemented its place as a movie that wasn't just banned, but actively avoided. Combat Shock didn't rely on chainsaws, cannibals, or supernatural demons. Its horror came from real life, and that made it one of the most haunting exploitation films America ever produced. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, 1986. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer was the film so disturbing that the MPAA didn't even bother with an X rating, they simply refused it. Directed by John McNaughton and loosely based on real-life killer Henry Lee Lucas, it painted a portrait of murder so cold and detached that censors treated it as dangerous. The story follows Henry, a drifter who kills without remorse, moving from one victim to the next with chilling casualness. Unlike other slashers of the time, there were no jump scares, no cartoonish villains, and no campy tone. It was raw, realistic, and deeply unsettling. Michael Rooker's performance as Henry was so convincing that many critics said it felt like watching a true crime documentary rather than a scripted film. In America, the MPAA refused to give it a rating, essentially banning it from wide theatrical release. Only underground cinemas and specialty houses dared to screen it, often uncut. Abroad, it faced bans in several countries and censorship in many others. Even festivals hesitated to program it, fearing backlash. What made Henry especially controversial was its refusal to moralize. The film didn't punish its killer, didn't soften the blows, and didn't offer comfort. Audiences left shaken, critics were divided, and censors panicked. On VHS, it became a cult legend, whispered about as one of the most disturbing films ever made. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer wasn't just banned, it was feared. And in the 1980s, few American films carried that kind of reputation. The 1980s may be remembered for blockbusters, neon, and MTV, but beneath the surface was a world of American exploitation films so raw they rattled theaters, outraged parents, and terrified censors. From killer Santas to twisted war veterans, these movies showed a side of cinema that polite society wanted buried, but bans only made them stronger, turning them into cult legends. Which of these would you dare to watch today? Drop your answer below, and remember, some films refuse to stay hidden.